November 1944. The Vosges Mountains, eastern France. At an elevation of nearly 900 meters above sea level, Corporal James Henderson crouched behind a frost-covered boulder, his breath forming small clouds in the bitterly cold mountain air. The African-American soldier from rural Georgia had spent the last 72 hours in these unforgiving peaks, and every fiber of his being told him that the German positions ahead were watching, waiting, and underestimating him in ways they would soon regret. The other members of his reconnaissance unit believed this would be another standard patrol through contested territory, perhaps encountering light resistance before returning to report enemy positions. They had no idea that Henderson had spent the previous 3 nights setting something in motion that would fundamentally change how their German adversaries viewed the capabilities of soldiers they had dismissed with cruel laughter. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded over the next 18 hours would transform a mocked farmer's son into a legend whispered about in both American and German military circles, and prove that the most dangerous enemy is the one you underestimate. Henderson had grown up in Valdosta, Georgia, where his family had farmed cotton and tobacco for 3 generations, on land they had purchased after emancipation. His great-grandfather had been among the first freed slaves to acquire property in Lowndes County, purchasing 40 acres in 1867 with money saved from years of labor. The Henderson family had built their lives on that land, expanding it to nearly 120 acres by the time James was born in 1920. His father, Samuel Henderson, had served in France during the First World War with the 92nd Infantry Division, one of the segregated African-American units that had fought with distinction at the Meuse-Argonne. Samuel had returned to Georgia with medals he kept in a drawer and stories he rarely told, carrying the weight of having fought for a country that still denied him basic civil rights. From his earliest memories, James Henderson absorbed lessons that would prove essential 25 years later in the Vosges Mountains. His father taught him to hunt in the pine forests and swamps of South Georgia, emphasizing patience above all else. Samuel would take young James out before dawn, positioning them near game trails, and they would wait motionless for hours. The lesson was not just about hunting deer or turkey, it was about observation, about understanding patterns in nature, about controlling your breathing and heartbeat so that animals could not sense your presence. Samuel taught his son to read tracks in soft earth, to identify which branches had been disturbed by passing animals, to notice the subtle changes in bird behavior that indicated predators nearby. The Henderson farm required constant labor, and James learned the value of systematic planning and meticulous execution. Samuel insisted that every task be done properly, whether it was plowing fields, repairing fences, or maintaining equipment. He would say that a farmer who cut corners would find those corners cutting back at him come harvest time. This philosophy of thoroughness, of doing things right the first time regardless of how long it took, became ingrained in James's character. When he enlisted in the army in 1942 at age 22, he brought with him a work ethic and attention to detail that immediately set him apart from many other recruits. The decision to enlist had not been simple. The United States military in 1942 remained rigidly segregated by official policy and deeply infected with racial prejudice at every level. African-American men who volunteered to fight for their country knew they would face discrimination not only from the enemy, but from their own command structure and fellow American soldiers. They would fight in segregated units, often commanded by white officers who had been given command of black troops as a punishment, or because they were deemed unfit for more prestigious assignments. They would be housed in separate barracks, eat in separate mess halls, and use separate recreational facilities. In many military bases, particularly in the South, local Jim Crow laws applied on base, creating the surreal situation of German prisoners of war receiving better treatment and more privileges than African-American soldiers. Yet Henderson enlisted anyway, driven by a complex mixture of motivations. There was patriotism, certainly. Despite all its failures and contradictions, America was his country, the land where his family had built their lives from nothing. There was also a determination to prove something, to demonstrate through actions that the racial theories undergirding both German ideology and American segregation were false, and there was a pragmatic recognition that military service might provide opportunities for advancement that rural Georgia never would. The Army offered a salary, training, and the possibility of seeing a world beyond Lowndes County. Basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, confirmed many of Henderson's expectations about military life. The training was rigorous but professionally conducted. The Army needed soldiers who could fight effectively, regardless of race. However, the segregation was absolute, and the racial attitudes of many white officers and non-commissioned officers were openly hostile. Henderson learned to navigate this environment with a careful balance of competence and deference, excelling at training while avoiding any behavior that might be perceived as challenging white authority. He qualified as expert with the M1903 Springfield rifle, achieving scores that would have marked him for sniper training in a non-segregated military. Instead, he was assigned to the 93rd Infantry Division, a segregated unit being prepared for deployment to the Pacific Theater. The plans changed in mid-1943 when manpower needs in the European theater became critical. The 93rd Division was reassigned to Europe, and Henderson found himself sailing across the Atlantic aboard a crowded transport ship in January 1944. The crossing took 3 weeks through rough winter seas, with hundreds of soldiers packed into holds designed for cargo. Henderson spent the time studying maps of Europe, reading military field manuals, and continuing the constant observation that had become his nature. He watched how different men handled the stress of the crossing, who showed leadership qualities, who panicked in rough weather, who maintained discipline even in uncomfortable conditions. The division landed in England initially, undergoing additional training in the wet and cold of the English countryside. It was during this period that Henderson came to the attention of Lieutenant Robert Morrison, a Virginia Military Institute graduate who had been assigned to command a reconnaissance platoon. Morrison was a complex figure, a product of Southern aristocracy, who nonetheless possessed a professional soldier's respect for competence regardless of its source. He recognized in Henderson a combination of natural fieldcraft and disciplined training that was rare. When Morrison requested volunteers for a reconnaissance unit that would operate in difficult terrain, Henderson immediately stepped forward. The reconnaissance unit underwent specialized training in map reading, radio communications, observation techniques, and independent operations. Henderson excelled at all of it, but particularly at the fieldcraft components. When instructors demonstrated techniques for moving silently through brush, for using terrain to mask movement, for creating observation positions that were invisible to enemy counter-reconnaissance, Henderson absorbed everything and added improvements based on his years in Georgia forests. His abilities were recognized by the other members of the unit, most of whom were also African-American soldiers from rural backgrounds. They formed a tight-knit group, bound by shared experience and mutual respect. In September 1944, the unit deployed to France as part of the broad Allied advance following the breakout from Normandy. The strategic situation by November had become complex. The rapid Allied advance of the summer had outrun supply lines and lost momentum. German forces recovering from the initial shock of the Normandy invasion had stabilized their defensive lines and were offering fierce resistance. The Vosges Mountains, a rugged range in eastern France near the German border, became a key battlefield. The terrain favored defenders, with steep slopes, dense forests, and limited road networks. German mountain infantry units, experienced troops with excellent equipment and training, held strong positions throughout the range. Henderson's reconnaissance unit operated in this environment for 2 months before the events of mid-November. They conducted patrols, gathered intelligence on German positions, and occasionally engaged in small-scale combat. Henderson established a reputation for thoroughness and reliability. When he submitted reconnaissance reports, they were detailed, accurate, and actionable. He had an uncanny ability to estimate enemy strength and identify key terrain features. Lieutenant Morrison came to trust Henderson's judgment completely, often assigning him to lead small patrols into the most difficult terrain. The incident that would set everything in motion occurred on November 14, 1944. Henderson's 8-man patrol had been ordered to reconnoiter a sector of the Vosges where American intelligence believed German forces had established observation posts. The terrain was extremely difficult. Steep slopes covered with pine forests, rocky outcroppings and narrow valleys where fog settled each morning. The patrol moved carefully through this landscape, using a combination of maps, compass work, and Henderson's natural navigation sense. They located the German observation post in early afternoon, positioned on a rocky prominence that provided commanding views of the surrounding valleys. The post was professionally established, with well-constructed fighting positions, camouflaged shelters, and carefully positioned observation points. As Henderson studied the position through his binoculars from a concealed location approximately 800 meters away, he estimated the enemy strength at 12 to 15 soldiers, probably a reinforced squad from a mountain infantry unit. What happened next would burn itself into Henderson's memory with absolute clarity. The German soldiers spotted the American patrol, or at least spotted Henderson, who had moved slightly ahead of his unit to get a better observation angle. From their elevated position, the Germans began calling out in broken English. Their voices carried clearly across the rocky valley, and their words were crude, mocking, filled with racial contempt. They laughed, making exaggerated gestures visible even at distance. They called Henderson by racial slurs, challenged his manhood, questioned his humanity. Some of the soldiers made monkey sounds, while others pantomimed in ways that left no doubt about their contempt. The effect on Henderson was complex and profound. He felt anger, certainly, burning hot and immediate, but he also felt something colder and more dangerous, a calculating fury that demanded not emotional reaction, but systematic response. His father's voice echoed in his memory, words spoken long ago after a particularly humiliating encounter with white racists in Valdosta. "Anger without discipline is just noise, son." But anger focused through discipline becomes a weapon. Henderson had learned this lesson many times growing up in Georgia, learning when to swallow rage and when to channel it productively. Lieutenant Morrison, observing the situation from behind Henderson, immediately ordered the patrol to withdraw. It was the tactically correct decision. The German position was too strong to assault with 8 men, and the Americans had gathered the intelligence they needed. Engaging would serve no military purpose, and would likely result in casualties. But as the patrol withdrew through the difficult terrain, using the forest cover and terrain features to mask their movement, Henderson was already thinking several moves ahead. He had noted the German position with extreme precision. He had observed not just where they were, but how they operated. The observation post appeared to be manned by 2 overlapping shifts, with soldiers rotating at regular intervals. He had seen a narrow trail connecting the observation post to what appeared to be a secondary position several hundred meters to the east. Most importantly, he had seen the casual confidence with which the German soldiers operated. They had mocked the American patrol openly, revealing their exact position through their taunting. They clearly felt secure in their advantageous terrain, comfortable with their routine, and contemptuous of any threat the Americans might pose. That evening, back at the patrol's temporary position in a partially damaged farmhouse that had been abandoned by its French owners, Henderson requested a private conversation with Lieutenant Morrison. The farmhouse, located in a small valley about 8 kilometers behind the American forward positions, served as a staging point for reconnaissance operations. It had stone walls that provided some protection, a mostly intact roof, and a cellar where the patrol could shelter during German artillery barrages. Morrison had established a small command post in what had been the farmhouse kitchen, with maps spread across a rough wooden table, and a radio set up to maintain contact with battalion headquarters. Henderson presented his request carefully. He wanted permission to conduct a solo reconnaissance mission, spending up to 48 hours observing the German positions in detail and gathering more comprehensive intelligence on their strength, routines, and vulnerabilities. He framed it entirely in terms of military value. The German observation post was clearly important to their defensive scheme. Understanding it better would help American forces plan operations in the sector, and he believed he could gather information that the full patrol could not obtain without risking detection. Morrison studied Henderson carefully before responding. The lieutenant had grown up in Lynchburg, Virginia, in a world where racial hierarchies were assumed as natural and unchangeable. His education at the Virginia Military Institute had been entirely segregated, and his military training had occurred in a rigidly segregated army. Yet Morrison possessed a quality that distinguished him from many of his contemporaries. He was capable of learning from experience, of adjusting his assumptions when reality contradicted them. 2 months of working with Henderson and the other soldiers in the reconnaissance unit had taught him that competence and courage had nothing to do with race. He had seen Henderson demonstrate abilities that exceeded those of many white soldiers Morrison had commanded. After several minutes of consideration, Morrison gave his approval with specific conditions. Henderson would operate alone, maintaining radio silence, unless he encountered an emergency situation. He would take only essential equipment to minimize his load and maximize mobility. He was authorized to gather intelligence, but explicitly prohibited from initiating offensive action unless absolutely necessary for self-defense. Most importantly, he was to return within 48 hours regardless of what intelligence he had or had not gathered. Morrison emphasized this final point. No heroics, Henderson. You go out, you observe, you come back with information. That is the mission, and nothing else. Henderson acknowledged the orders with a simple "yes, sir," but even as he spoke, he was already planning something that would technically violate the prohibition on offensive action. In his mind, he was not planning to initiate aggression. He was planning to create a situation where the German troops would reveal themselves to be the aggressors, justifying a defensive response. It was a fine distinction, perhaps even a dishonest one, but Henderson had learned in Georgia that sometimes survival and success required operating in gray areas that official rules did not acknowledge. He spent the evening preparing with meticulous care. His equipment loadout was minimal but carefully chosen. He carried his M1903 Springfield rifle, a weapon he knew intimately after hundreds of hours of practice. He brought 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips, a quantity that represented a balance between firepower and weight. His personal gear included a canteen with 2 liters of water, basic rations sufficient for 3 days, a compass, detailed topographic maps of the sector, binoculars, a small entrenching tool, 30 meters of thin but strong wire salvaged from field telephone supplies, 3 signal flares that had been deemed defective and set aside for disposal, but which Henderson believed might still function, and his basic survival kit. The signal flares were key to Henderson's developing plan. They had been marked as defective because their ignition mechanisms were unreliable, sometimes failing to work when the activation cord was pulled. But Henderson had tested them secretly and found that they would ignite consistently if triggered by a stronger mechanical force. He could use them to create a deception, a false narrative that would manipulate German responses in ways they would not anticipate. Henderson departed the farmhouse at 0300 hours on November 15th, moving through the darkness with the confidence of someone who had spent his entire life navigating rural darkness. He did not use a flashlight. His eyes were already adjusted to the dim starlight, and he knew that any artificial light would compromise his position. He moved toward the German-controlled sector, using a route he had memorized from the maps, a path that followed terrain features rather than direct lines, using valleys and ridgelines to maintain concealment. The journey to the vicinity of the German observation post took 8 hours, though the straight-line distance was less than 10 kilometers. Henderson moved slowly, stopping frequently to listen, to observe, to ensure he was not walking into German patrols or triggering any early warning systems they might have established. He crossed 2 small streams, moved through dense forest where the ground was covered with pine needles that muffled his footsteps, and climbed several steep slopes using hands and feet on the rocky terrain. By noon on November 15th, Henderson had established a concealed observation position approximately 1,000 meters from the German observation post, in a location that provided good sight lines while offering multiple retreat routes if he was discovered. He spent the afternoon simply watching, using his binoculars to study every detail of the German position. He counted soldiers during shift changes, noted the exact times when reliefs occurred, observed which paths the Germans used when moving between positions, and identified patterns in their behavior. The German troops operated with professional discipline, but also with a degree of comfortable routine that suggested they had been in this position for several weeks. Without significant threats, they maintained regular observation schedules, but Henderson noticed that their alertness seemed to peak during dawn and dusk, the traditional times for attacks, while diminishing during midday and late afternoon. They had established well-worn paths between their primary observation post and the secondary position to the east, paths that took the most efficient routes through the rocky terrain, but which also created predictable patterns. Most importantly, Henderson identified the key vulnerability, the narrow trail connecting the two positions. The trail was necessary because the terrain offered no other reasonable route between the posts. It wound through a section of particularly rough ground, bounded on both sides by steep rocky slopes and dense vegetation. The trail was approximately 600 meters long, but there was a section of about 80 meters where it passed between two rock formations, creating a natural choke point. Any soldiers using the trail would have to traverse this section single file, and the surrounding terrain limited their ability to see or maneuver laterally. As darkness fell on November 15th, Henderson moved closer to the trail, approaching from a direction that the German security measures seemed not to cover as thoroughly. He found a position approximately 400 meters from the trail choke point, on elevated ground that provided an excellent field of view. The position was in a cluster of wind-bent pines, with a large boulder behind him that would prevent any sound echoes from traveling backward. In front of his position, the ground sloped downward toward the trail, with sparse vegetation that would not obstruct his view but was thick enough to break up his silhouette. Henderson spent several hours preparing this position with extreme care. He cleared away small branches and pine needles that might make noise if he shifted position. He arranged several rocks to create a natural rifle rest that would support stable shooting. He identified landmarks along the trail that he could use as range references, estimating distances with techniques his father had taught him for hunting. He planned his withdrawal route, identifying 3 different paths he could use depending on how the situation developed. As the moon rose, providing dim illumination across the mountainside, Henderson began the second phase of his plan. He moved along the trail to the choke point section, working slowly and stopping frequently to ensure no German patrols were nearby. Once at the trail, he created what would appear to be hasty defensive positions. At 3 locations, he disturbed the earth slightly, broke small branches in patterns consistent with soldiers moving through quickly, and left subtle traces that trained troops would recognize. He was writing a story in the landscape itself, creating false evidence of American reconnaissance activity. At the far end of the choke point section, Henderson set up his deception device using the signal flares and wire. The 3 flares were positioned in a small depression beside the trail, arranged so they would produce maximum visual effect when ignited. The wire was strung across the trail at ankle height, positioned at a point where soldiers walking in staggered column formation would most likely step. The wire connected to a simple lever mechanism Henderson constructed from small branches and rocks, designed so that when tripped, it would generate enough force to trigger the flare's ignition mechanism simultaneously. The construction of this device required nearly 3 hours of careful work in darkness, with Henderson using only his hands and his intimate understanding of simple mechanics. He tested the trigger mechanism multiple times, adjusting the tension and positioning until it functioned reliably. Then he carefully concealed all evidence of his presence, using natural materials to disguise the wire and flares so they would be invisible to someone walking the trail in daylight or darkness. The result was elegant in its simplicity, a trap that would activate automatically when German soldiers used the trail, creating a spectacular display that would appear to be American signal equipment or defensive preparation. Henderson returned to his firing position and settled in to wait, beginning a vigil that would last through the remaining hours of darkness and into the following morning. The temperature dropped steadily through the night, falling below freezing as clear skies allowed heat to radiate away from the mountain. Henderson wore every layer of clothing he had brought, but the cold still penetrated to his bones. His fingers became numb inside his gloves, requiring him to periodically exercise them to maintain dexterity. His toes ached in his boots, despite thick wool socks. But Henderson had spent countless cold nights in Georgia deer stands, learning to endure discomfort without moving, without breaking his vigil. His father had taught him that hunting was 90% waiting and 10% action, and that the hunter who could not master the waiting would never succeed at the action. He ate small amounts of his rations, drinking sparingly from his canteen to conserve water. He did not sleep, but instead entered a state of alert rest, maintaining awareness of his surroundings while conserving energy. The night hours passed with agonizing slowness. Henderson listened to the mountain sounds, wind moving through pine branches, small animals moving through undergrowth, the occasional distant sound of artillery fire from sectors where other units were engaged. He thought about his family in Georgia, wondering if his father was sitting on the farmhouse porch at this moment, rocking in the chair he had built with his own hands. He thought about the German soldiers in their observation posts, probably rotating guard duty, probably complaining about the cold, probably convinced that they faced no serious threat from American forces they had dismissed with contempt. Dawn arrived slowly on November 16, 1944. The darkness gradually gave way to deep blue, then to pale grey as the sun approached the eastern horizon. Henderson could see his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. His body was stiff from hours of immobility, but he began slight movements to restore flexibility, knowing that when the moment came, he would need to move quickly and precisely. At 0545 hours, Henderson observed movement at the German observation post through his binoculars. The night shift was preparing for relief, going through the routines that Henderson had observed the previous day. Soldiers emerged from their sheltered positions, stretching, stamping their feet to restore circulation, checking equipment. Henderson could see them clearly despite the distance, silhouettes against the lightening sky. Some were smoking, the small glowing points of cigarettes visible in the dim light. At 0600 hours precisely, 6 German soldiers departed from the observation post and began moving along the trail toward the secondary position. They moved in a staggered column formation, maintaining appropriate tactical spacing of approximately 3 to 5 meters between individuals. Their weapons were slung over their shoulders or held casually. Clearly, they did not expect to encounter any threats during this routine shift change. Henderson could hear fragments of their conversation carrying across the quiet morning air, German words he did not understand, but which conveyed the casual tone of soldiers performing a familiar, unthreatening task. Henderson controlled his breathing using techniques he had practiced since childhood, slowing his heart rate through conscious effort and mental discipline. His finger rested alongside the trigger guard of his Springfield rifle, not touching the trigger itself. Not yet. Patience. The first lesson and the last lesson, the foundation of everything his father had taught him. The soldiers entered the trail section Henderson had prepared, moving with the confident casualness of troops who had walked this same path dozens of times without incident. The first 2 soldiers passed the tripwire point safely. Henderson had positioned the wire specifically to catch the 3rd or 4th soldier in the column, knowing that the lead soldiers would typically walk along the edge of the trail where footing was most secure, while soldiers further back might move more centrally. The 3rd soldier, a sergeant based on the insignia Henderson had observed through his binoculars, walked directly down the center of the path. His boot caught the wire with enough force to trigger the mechanism Henderson had constructed. The signal flares ignited with a brilliant white light that seemed almost explosive in the dim morning. The intensity was far greater than Henderson had anticipated. The 3 flares together created a spectacular display, burning with the brilliant magnesium white intensity characteristic of military pyrotechnics. Thick white smoke billowed upward, creating a rapidly expanding cloud that rose into the still morning air. The visual effect was dramatic and shocking, exactly what Henderson had intended. The German soldiers' reaction was immediate and entirely predictable. Their military training took over, overriding conscious thought. Believing they had triggered an American defensive position or stepped into some kind of trap, they immediately sought cover and prepared to return fire. But the trail offered limited options for concealment. The choke point section was bounded by steep rocky slopes and dense vegetation that prevented lateral movement. The soldiers scattered to whatever cover they could find, grouping together in defensive positions that were textbook correct for responding to a ground-level threat, but catastrophically vulnerable to fire from Henderson's elevated position. Henderson did not rush. He had 6 targets now clustered in 3 groups of 2, all focused entirely on the burning flares and the smoke cloud ahead of them. They were looking in completely the wrong direction, searching for threats from the trail ahead or from the valley below. None of them considered the possibility of a threat from an elevated position hundreds of meters away. Henderson selected his first target carefully, the sergeant who appeared to be giving orders to the others, gesturing and shouting instructions that Henderson could hear but not understand. The Springfield sight picture was clear and stable. Henderson's breathing was controlled, his heart rate steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The squeeze of the trigger was smooth and practiced, exactly as he had done thousands of times in practice. The rifle's report echoed across the mountains, a sharp crack that bounced off rocky surfaces and seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. Henderson's carefully chosen position had turned the mountain terrain into an acoustic weapon, making it nearly impossible for the German soldiers to determine the actual origin of the fire. By the time the sound registered with the German troops, Henderson had already worked the bolt of his Springfield, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. His second target was already acquired, one of the soldiers who had moved to cover behind a boulder. The soldier was partially exposed, visible from Henderson's elevated angle, though he would have been concealed from ground-level fire. Henderson's second shot followed approximately 8 seconds after the first, a deliberate pace that allowed for proper sight picture and trigger control while maintaining psychological pressure on the enemy. The effect on the remaining German soldiers was exactly what Henderson had anticipated, based on his understanding of human psychology under stress. They could not locate the origin of the fire. The acoustic properties of the terrain, combined with Henderson's position and the continuing distraction of the smoke from the flares, created complete tactical confusion. Some soldiers attempted to return fire, shooting at where they thought the threat might be, but their shots went wild, striking rocks and trees hundreds of meters from Henderson's actual position. Henderson's third shot came 12 seconds after the second. He was not engaging in rapid fire. Such an approach would have been wasteful and potentially counterproductive. Instead, he was maintaining a deliberate, methodical pace that allowed each shot to be precisely aimed while compounding the psychological pressure on the German troops. Each shot demonstrated that they were not facing random or lucky fire, but rather a disciplined marksman who knew exactly what he was doing. The fourth shot targeted a soldier who was attempting to organize a withdrawal. Henderson recognized leadership behavior even at this distance, and he knew that removing leaders from the tactical situation would accelerate the collapse of organized resistance. The fifth shot followed, as the remaining soldiers abandoned any attempt at coordinated defense and simply tried to escape the kill zone. But their attempt to withdraw brought them directly into the most open section of the trail, where Henderson's field of view was unobstructed and his range estimation was most precise. The final shot came approximately 90 seconds after the first. In that brief span of time, Henderson had engaged 6 targets with 6 rounds fired, each shot carefully aimed and deliberately paced. The entire engagement had unfolded exactly as he had planned during his hours of observation and preparation. The German soldiers had reacted precisely as Henderson had predicted they would, moving into positions that seemed tactically sound in response to the threat they believed they faced, but which left them completely exposed to the actual threat Henderson represented. Henderson remained in position for 5 full minutes after the last shot, his rifle trained on the trail section, watching for any movement or any response from the German observation posts. He counted slowly in his mind, reaching 300 before he allowed himself to shift position. The mountains remained quiet, except for the wind and the gradually diminishing smoke from the signal flares. There was no indication that the German observation posts had detected what had occurred. The acoustic confusion created by the terrain meant that the rifle shots might have been mistaken for sounds from other sectors, or possibly not heard at all over the distance and through the filtering effect of the landscape. Only when Henderson was satisfied that no immediate response was coming did he begin his withdrawal. He did not approach the trail or attempt to verify outcomes. Such action would have been tactically foolish and operationally unnecessary. Instead, he began moving through a carefully planned withdrawal route that took him away from both the trail and the German observation posts, using terrain features and forest cover to mask his movement. He moved slowly and methodically, stopping frequently to listen and observe, ensuring that he was not being tracked or pursued. The withdrawal took Henderson 14 hours, far longer than would have been necessary if he had moved directly back to American lines. But Henderson was not interested in speed. He was focused on security and on erasing evidence of his presence. He moved through streams to break any trail, used rocky ground where his footprints would not show, and took a circuitous route that would make tracking nearly impossible. He moved through sectors where he knew German patrols were unlikely, using the intelligence he had gathered during his reconnaissance to avoid enemy positions. He arrived back at the farmhouse where Lieutenant Morrison and the patrol were positioned at approximately 2100 hours on November 16th. He emerged from the darkness like a ghost, still carrying his rifle, moving with the careful control of someone who had spent days operating alone in hostile territory. Morrison, who had been growing increasingly concerned as the 48-hour deadline approached and then passed, felt relief flood through him when Henderson appeared. Henderson's debriefing was characteristically thorough and precise. He provided detailed information about German positions, strength estimates, routine patterns, and vulnerabilities. He described the terrain in detail, noting features that would be relevant for future operations. He provided intelligence that would prove immediately valuable for planning larger operations in the sector, but initially he did not mention the engagement on the trail. It was only when Morrison noted the residue on Henderson's rifle and the reduced ammunition count that the full story emerged. Morrison faced a command dilemma that reflected the complexities and contradictions of the era. Henderson had technically violated his orders by engaging the enemy during what was supposed to be a reconnaissance-only mission. By any strict interpretation of military regulations, this constituted disobedience and could warrant disciplinary action. However, Henderson had also eliminated a significant enemy position through exceptional tactical planning and execution. He had demonstrated fieldcraft, marksmanship, and tactical judgment that far exceeded normal expectations. Morrison's decision would reflect not only on Henderson, but on the broader question of how African-American soldiers were treated within the military system. Morrison chose to frame the engagement in his report as defensive action taken when Henderson's position was compromised and immediate threat was imminent. This interpretation was technically defensible, though it required a generous reading of the circumstances. More importantly, Morrison wrote a detailed commendation of Henderson's actions, praising his reconnaissance work, his tactical acumen, and his execution under difficult conditions. The report made clear that Henderson had operated with exceptional competence and had achieved significant tactical success through careful planning and superior fieldcraft. The German response to the trail incident unfolded over the following 72 hours and provided independent validation of Henderson's success. German mountain infantry units launched intensive search and security operations, dramatically increasing their patrol activity and modifying their routine procedures. American intelligence intercepted German communications, indicating significant concern about security in the sector. German observation posts altered their shift change procedures, increased security around movement routes, and issued warnings to all units about the possibility of American reconnaissance elements operating in areas previously considered secure. When German forces eventually discovered the trail scene, they conducted a thorough investigation that revealed the sophistication of what had occurred. German after-action reports, captured later in the war and translated by Allied intelligence officers, demonstrated that they had correctly reconstructed most of the tactical situation. They identified Henderson's firing position through analysis of bullet trajectories and cartridge locations. They recognized the deception created by the signal flares. They assessed the timing and precision of the engagement based on physical evidence at the scene. Their analysis reached a conclusion that clearly surprised and concerned their command. A single American soldier had planned and carried out an ambush that neutralized an entire 6-man patrol of experienced mountain infantry troops. The German reports were remarkable for their tone of professional respect and strategic concern. One intelligence officer noted that the incident demonstrated American reconnaissance capabilities, far exceeding what German forces had anticipated. Another report specifically mentioned that the planning and execution showed intimate knowledge of German routines, suggesting either extensive observation or access to intelligence sources. Several reports recommended immediate changes to security procedures, increased counter-reconnaissance operations, and reconsideration of assumptions about American tactical capabilities in mountain warfare. Nowhere in these captured German documents was there mockery, dismissal, or racial contempt. The language was clinical, professional, and respectful in the way that soldiers respect a capable adversary. The transformation in German attitudes, from the cruel taunting of November 14th to the sober analysis of November 19th, represented a fundamental shift forced by undeniable evidence. Henderson had not argued against their prejudices. He had simply proven them wrong through actions that could not be disputed or dismissed. The broader impact of Henderson's actions rippled through both American and German forces in ways that extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Within 2 weeks, American intelligence noted significant changes in German operational patterns throughout the Vosges sector. Mountain infantry units modified shift change procedures, increased security patrols, altered communication protocols, and displayed heightened vigilance in areas they had previously considered secure. This change in German behavior provided American commanders with valuable intelligence about their adversaries' concerns and priorities, while also creating operational opportunities that could be exploited. Among American forces, particularly within African American units, Henderson's story circulated rapidly through informal networks of communication. Soldiers shared the account in letters home, in conversations during rare moments of rest, in the barracks and mess halls of segregated units scattered across the European theater. The details grew slightly in the telling, as military stories always do, but the core remained constant and powerfully resonant. A black soldier from rural Georgia had been mocked and dismissed by German troops, then had systematically outplanned, outmaneuvered, and outfought them using skills learned on a Georgia farm, and determination forged through a lifetime of proving himself in a society that refused to acknowledge his worth. The story resonated particularly deeply because it addressed a contradiction that African American soldiers lived with every day. They served in a military fighting against an enemy explicitly founded on racial supremacy and genocidal ideology. Yet that same military maintained rigid racial segregation and systemic discrimination against its own black soldiers. German prisoners of war held in American camps often received better treatment and more privileges than African American soldiers serving guard duty at those same camps. On military bases in the American South, local Jim Crow laws applied on federal property, creating situations where German prisoners could use facilities that were prohibited to black American soldiers. The contradictions were profound, painful, and impossible to ignore. In this context, Henderson's achievement represented more than tactical success. It became a symbolic victory that spoke to larger truths about capability, worth, and human dignity. Every African American soldier who heard the story understood its deeper meaning. Henderson had proven through actions that could not be disputed that racial theories undergirding both German ideology and American segregation were false. He had demonstrated that competence, courage, and tactical brilliance had nothing to do with race and everything to do with individual ability, training, and determination. The formal recognition of Henderson's actions moved through military bureaucracy at a pace that reflected the systemic challenges of the era. Lieutenant Morrison submitted his commendation in late November 1944, recommending Henderson for the Silver Star, one of the highest decorations for gallantry in action. The recommendation worked its way through division headquarters, corps headquarters, and eventually to theater command. At each level, officers reviewed the documentation, assessed the action, and made decisions about appropriate recognition. The process took 4 months. Part of the delay was simply bureaucratic. The military system for processing awards was overwhelmed by the volume of actions occurring across multiple theaters of war. But part of the delay also reflected the complications of recognizing African American soldiers' achievements within a segregated military. Some officers were reluctant to approve high-level decorations for black soldiers, operating from prejudices that questioned whether such soldiers deserved the same recognition as white troops. Others worried about the political implications of prominently recognizing African American military achievements, fearing it might provide ammunition to those calling for military desegregation. But Morrison's documentation was thorough, the tactical success was undeniable, and the German documents captured later provided independent corroboration. In March 1945, Henderson was awarded the Silver Star in a ceremony at division headquarters. The citation praised his exceptional reconnaissance work, tactical acumen, and gallantry in action against enemy forces. The language was formal and restrained, as military citations always are, but for those who understood the context, the award represented significant recognition. The ceremony itself was a modest affair, far less elaborate than those often conducted for white soldiers receiving similar decorations. This disparity reflected the segregated nature of military life, where black soldiers and white soldiers operated in parallel but separate worlds. Nevertheless, Henderson stood at attention as the Silver Star was pinned to his uniform, saluted, and accepted the commendations of officers who had come to respect his abilities, if not always to question the system that segregated him. For Henderson personally, the medal represented validation but not vindication. He was proud of his achievement and grateful for the recognition, but he understood that a single medal did not change the fundamental structures of racism that pervaded both the military and American society. He would still return from patrol to segregated barracks, eat in segregated mess halls, and face discrimination from white soldiers and officers who judged him by his race rather than his abilities. The war would eventually end, and he would return to Georgia, where Jim Crow laws still governed every aspect of life for African Americans. A silver star worn on his chest would not protect him from the humiliations and dangers of life in the segregated South. Yet the recognition mattered, both symbolically and practically. It placed Henderson's achievement in the official military record, creating documentation that historians would later discover and share. It provided inspiration to other African American soldiers who saw that exceptional performance could earn recognition even within a flawed system. And it created a small crack in the edifice of segregation, a data point that contradicted the ideological assumptions underlying racial separation. Over time, the accumulation of such contradictions, such undeniable proofs of equal capability, would help undermine the entire system. The strategic lessons from Henderson's action were studied by military analysts during and after the war. His approach demonstrated several principles that became incorporated into reconnaissance doctrine and training: the value of patient observation before action, the importance of understanding enemy routines and psychology, the effectiveness of using terrain to multiply individual combat power, the utility of deception in creating tactical advantages. All of these became teaching points in military courses on reconnaissance operations and small unit tactics. The engagement also highlighted the critical importance of psychological preparation and mental discipline in combat operations. Henderson had operated alone for days in hostile territory, maintaining focus and discipline despite cold, hunger, isolation, and the constant threat of discovery. His ability to control his emotional response to mockery and channel it into systematic tactical planning demonstrated a level of maturity and self-discipline that military psychologists would later recognize as essential for special operations forces. In many ways, Henderson's independent operation in the Vosges Mountains prefigured the kind of long-range reconnaissance and independent action that would later characterize special forces operations. Henderson survived the war, participating in the continued advance through eastern France and into Germany itself. He saw the war end in May 1945, witnessing the collapse of the German military and the liberation of concentration camps that revealed the full horror of the ideology his country had fought against. The experience of seeing Dachau, Buchenwald, and other camps left Henderson with a complex understanding of what the war had been about. The German regime's genocidal racial ideology, taken to its most extreme conclusion, had produced industrial-scale murder of millions based on nothing more than race, religion, and ethnicity. Henderson understood viscerally that the prejudice he faced in America and the German racial policies existed on the same spectrum, differing in degree but not in fundamental kind. He returned to Georgia in late 1945, mustering out at Fort Benning with an honorable discharge, a Silver Star, and several other service decorations. The return to civilian life was difficult, as it was for most veterans, but particularly challenging for African American veterans who had tasted a degree of respect and recognition in the military, however imperfect, only to return to a society that treated them as second-class citizens. Henderson resumed farming, taking over increasing responsibility for the family land as his father aged. He married in 1946, choosing a woman from Valdosta whose family had known the Hendersons for generations. Together, they built a life, raised 4 children, and became pillars of their community. Henderson rarely spoke about his military service, a reticence common among veterans, but carrying additional weight for African American veterans of that era. They had served a country that still denied them basic rights, had fought for freedom abroad while facing oppression at home. The contradictions were painful and difficult to discuss. Henderson's Silver Star remained in a drawer, shown only occasionally when his children asked about it. When they asked what he had done to earn it, he would say simply that he had done his job in France, nothing more. It was the civil rights movement of the 1960s that brought Henderson's story back into public consciousness. Researchers documenting the contributions of African American soldiers during World War II began excavating military records, finding accounts like Henderson's that had been filed away and largely forgotten. They discovered Morrison's after-action reports, found the German documents that corroborated the incident, and recognized the story's significance. Henderson was invited to speak at veterans events, to share his experiences with younger generations, to help document a part of American military history that had been systematically overlooked. At a veterans event in Atlanta in 1968, Henderson gave his first extended public account of the Vosges Mountains operation. He was 48 years old, his hair graying, his hands still strong from years of farm work. He spoke quietly, without drama or embellishment. Describing the events in the same factual manner he had used in his original debriefing to Morrison. But the audience, which included both black and white veterans, civil rights activists, and historians, understood the deeper significance. This was not just a story about tactical success, it was a story about human dignity, about the cost of prejudice, about the undeniable equality of human capability when given opportunity. The story resonated particularly powerfully in 1968, a year of tremendous social upheaval and transformation. The civil rights movement had achieved major legislative victories with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But the struggle for full equality continued. Young African Americans, particularly those involved in the Black Power movement, were asserting pride in their identity and demanding recognition of their contributions to American history. Henderson's story provided historical evidence of African American competence, courage, and achievement that could not be dismissed or minimized. Henderson's grandson, Michael Henderson, became a historian specializing in African American military history, inspired directly by his grandfather's experiences. In interviews conducted for the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture, Michael shared stories his grandfather had told him in private, stories that James Henderson had never shared publicly. These conversations revealed the psychological complexity of Henderson's position during and after the war. He had fought for a country that denied him basic rights, served in a military that segregated him, and faced an enemy that mocked him for his race. Yet he had chosen to serve with excellence, to prove through actions what should never have required proof. That human worth transcends racial categories. One particular conversation stood out in Michael's memory. James Henderson, late in his life when age and illness had loosened some of his characteristic reticence, described the moment after the Vosges engagement when he sat alone in his firing position, looking at the trail below. He said he felt no triumph, no sense of victory. Instead, he felt a profound sadness that human beings could be so foolish as to judge others by superficial characteristics rather than by character and capability. The German soldiers who had died on that trail had been capable troops, well-trained and professional. Their fatal error had been to allow ideology and prejudice to blind them to the threat Henderson represented. It was a waste, Henderson said, a waste of lives and potential, all because of beliefs that had no foundation in reality. The broader historical context of Henderson's service continued to resonate through subsequent decades. The segregated military of World War II began to change in 1948 when President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, ordering the integration of the armed forces. The order was implemented gradually and incompletely, facing resistance from many quarters, but it represented official recognition that segregation undermined military effectiveness and contradicted American values. The performance of African American soldiers during World War II, including individual achievements like Henderson's, provided undeniable evidence supporting integration. The Korean conflict, beginning in 1950, saw the first significant combat integration of American military units. African American soldiers served alongside white soldiers in integrated units, and the military discovered what should have been obvious all along. Integrated units performed at least as well as segregated units, and the artificial barriers created by segregation actually reduced military effectiveness by preventing optimal use of available personnel. Henderson, watching these developments from his farm in Georgia, felt vindicated in some ways. The military had finally acknowledged officially what he had known all along. Competence and courage had nothing to do with race. Yet Henderson also understood that military integration, while important, represented only one aspect of the broader struggle for civil rights. The same country that integrated its military in the 1950s maintained segregated schools, restaurants, public transportation, and voting systems throughout the South. Henderson's children attended segregated schools in Valdosta, faced the daily humiliations of Jim Crow laws, and grew up in a society that treated them as inferior, despite their father's Silver Star and proven record of service. The contradictions remained, perhaps even more glaring given the military's official integration. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 through 56, the Little Rock school integration crisis of 1957, the lunch counter sit-ins beginning in 1960, all of these events of the civil rights movement occurred against the backdrop of veterans like Henderson who had proved their equality through service but still faced systemic discrimination at home. Henderson supported the civil rights movement quietly, contributing money to the NAACP, attending meetings at his church where strategies were discussed, and encouraging his children to pursue education and opportunity despite the obstacles they faced. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law, Henderson was 44 years old, the same age his father had been when James enlisted in 1942. The symmetry was not lost on him. His father had fought in the First World War and returned to a segregated society that denied him basic rights. James had fought in the Second World War and faced the same situation. Now, finally, the legal foundations of segregation were being dismantled. The change came too late for his father, who had passed away in 1956 without seeing legal segregation end. But it came in time for Henderson's children and grandchildren. The impact of stories like Henderson's extended beyond the immediate civil rights context. Military historians studying World War II tactics and operations found in Henderson's Vosges engagement an exemplary case study of individual initiative, tactical planning, and force multiplication. The engagement was analyzed in military staff colleges, used as a teaching example in courses on reconnaissance operations, and cited in doctrinal publications on small unit tactics. The analysis typically focused on the technical and tactical aspects, but some military educators recognized the broader lesson. The American military had systematically underutilized African American soldiers' capabilities during the war, wasting human resources through prejudice and missing opportunities for enhanced combat effectiveness. Henderson passed away in 1993 after a long illness. His funeral in Valdosta drew hundreds of attendees from the local community and beyond. Veterans organizations sent representatives, including white veterans who had come to respect Henderson's achievements, even if they had been slow to question the segregated system they had all served within. The Silver Star was displayed prominently, along with Henderson's other military decorations and photographs from his service. The eulogy emphasized his contributions to the community, his work with young people, his service in the church, his quiet dignity and strength. The military service was mentioned, but Henderson's family knew he would have wanted the emphasis placed on his life's work in Georgia rather than on his brief time in France. The legacy Henderson left extended through multiple generations of his family. His children all pursued higher education, taking advantage of opportunities that had been denied to their father. His grandchildren entered professions ranging from medicine to law to education, building on the foundation Henderson and his wife had established. Michael Henderson, who became a historian, made it his life's work to document stories like his grandfather's, ensuring that the contributions of African American soldiers would not be forgotten or minimized in historical accounts of American military history. The German perspective on the Vosges incident, revealed through captured documents and post-war interviews, provided a fascinating counterpoint to the American narrative. German veterans who had served in the sector, when interviewed decades later, often expressed genuine respect for the tactical skill displayed in the ambush. Some described it as a turning point in their understanding, a moment when their ideological indoctrination collided with undeniable reality. One former officer stated in an interview conducted in the 1970s that the incident had planted seeds of doubt about everything he had been taught regarding racial hierarchies and human capability. Those seeds, he said, eventually grew into a complete rejection of the ideology he had served. The psychological journey from contemptuous mockery to respectful acknowledgement of capability represented a transformation that occurred on both individual and institutional levels. The German soldiers who encountered evidence of Henderson's tactical success could not maintain their prejudices in the face of undeniable facts. This same dynamic played out across millions of individual encounters during and after the war, gradually eroding the ideological foundations of both German racial theories and American segregation. Henderson's story was one small part of this massive transformation, but it illustrated the process clearly. Prejudice cannot survive sustained contact with contradictory evidence. In 2006, the publication of A Comprehensive History of African American Soldiers in World War II brought Henderson's story to a new generation of readers. The book, based on exhaustive research in both American and German archives, placed Henderson's actions within the broader context of African American military service and the civil rights struggle. The author interviewed Henderson's surviving family members, obtained access to his personal papers and letters, and traced the impact of his service through subsequent decades. The resulting account presented Henderson as representative of thousands of African American soldiers who had served with distinction, despite facing discrimination from both enemy and ally. Henderson's personal papers, donated to the Smithsonian Institution after his death, revealed additional dimensions of his experience. His letters home during the war were carefully crafted to avoid worrying his family while hinting at the challenges he faced. A letter written in December 1944, a month after the Vosges engagement, mentioned casually that he had been recommended for recognition, but did not specify what for or explain the circumstances. His wife's letters to him, preserved in the same collection, expressed pride in his service while describing the continuing struggles of African Americans on the home front. The correspondence painted a picture of two people navigating an impossibly contradictory world with grace, determination, and mutual support. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.